let's start in May. Star Wars comes out, and we have back here, it says A New Hope. It wasn't A New Hope back then, it just said Star Wars. The crawl came up.
Right, that was changed in '81 when they did a re-release, a theatrical release. Up to then, it was just Star Wars. And thinking about the fact that this came out in May, that means that January through April were inherently less awesome than the other two-thirds of the year that we're covering. And that's important because the build-up to this, people didn't realize how big a thing this was going to be. I mean, a lot of people around Lucas were telling him that this was going to be a disaster, and up until the point that it came out. So it's fantastic that it had such a quick flip around. And once it got into the hands of ordinary people, this became a cultural phenomenon like nothing else in American popular culture had ever been.
I mean, you could almost think of Star Wars as an indie film of its day, right? Because it had a lot of unknown actors in it. They really had a hard time getting a budget to really make it. You know, they didn't have big backing. Nobody was like super really excited about it. And like you said, it was a real challenge to get this thing out. But man, once it came out, what a game changer.
And all his director friends, with the exception of Steven Spielberg, thought this is a disaster. This is terrible.
Well, it's also, though, it's interesting because for him, he was coming off of, for Lucas, he's coming off of American Graffiti, which was, you know, this acclaimed little film, personal film, coming of age, you know, nostalgic, and then he goes right to a science fiction movie, which obviously is, you know, was one of his loves. But, you know, he had done THX 1138 before that as well. But this was, you know, and again, like, he only did Star Wars because he couldn't get the rights to Flash Gordon. So if he had gotten the Flash Gordon rights, we might not, who knows what would have happened, you know?
Right, because instead he creates this fascinating kind of East meets West universe where all these Eastern elements that were permeating American popular culture around this period, you know, spiritualism and Eastern mysticism and martial arts meet classical, like Old West Western genre pieces and all mixes together with space guns and laser swords and galactic wizards, and somehow it all clicked just perfectly.
Well, and mythology, right? I mean, that was the thing. These were stories that everybody could relate to, and I think that's what really made it so successful at the time as well. This is something that, you know, you had a kind of real analog, dirty sci-fi world as opposed to these very stark, white, clean, like, you know, 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Star Wars was a very lived-in world.
It was
Things
a very
were broken,
lived-in world.
things
It was
were dirty.
real.
Yeah, why throw something away when you can duct tape it back together? And that's the way life works, and it worked because of that.
The one thing that really touched me most about Star Wars, and the thing that I still love about it to this day, is something you touched on earlier. It's a science fiction fairy tale, right? There are, you know, blasters and lasers, but they're also laser swords, right? And they're princesses, so it's this interesting melding of those two worlds. And really epitomizing the characters of Luke and Han, where Han's the realist, he's pragmatic, you know, in my experience, there's no such thing as luck. And Luke's this idealist who believes in more. And like, that's just such a universal kind of conflict, I think, that's central to who we are as people.
Right.
That's what really speaks to me.
And I think, not only the relationships with the people, but also, you know, even though it was in a galaxy far, far away a long time ago, right?
The fairy tale thing again, a long time ago.
It was something that was futuristic, but you could understand all the technologies there. Again, laser swords and little switches on Darth Vader and dials to change things, as opposed to being, you know, digital and being more abstract. It was something that actually was tangible.
Yeah, it was also, though, it definitely spoke to, you know, generational elements as well, and that, you know, there was a lot of World War II influence in there. I mean, with the galactic, and the Galactic Empire, I don't think it's any accident that they dress like Nazis. You know?
What?
And you know, there was a lot of there really was this incredible stew of stuff, right to like samurai stuff, everything. I mean, you know, the fact that Hidden Fortress was a huge influence on there, and so yeah, I mean, to me it really is a perfect marriage of all these sort of disparate ideas that shouldn't work. You know?
And you mentioned the dogfighting. It left this legacy too. I mean, you think about what's come out of it. You think about something like Industrial Light and Magic. You know, when they get together and they start trying to make these effects.
We're talking about too, right? Trying to be so scrappy with this, made his own like effects studio to be able to pull this off, right?
It's the same thing Peter Jackson did with Weta Workshop. He realized, like, there's nobody out there that can do what I want to do, that can get my vision on screen, and that's the birth of Industrial Light and Magic.
And ILM and just Lucasfilm in general have essentially given us the careers of people who are now dictating the popular culture, like David Fincher worked on Jedi, you know, Joe Johnston, you know, and the fact that even like John Lasseter, you know, and Pixar kind of came out of this whole movement. So it's an amazing legacy to just look at how one movie spawned everything that we kind of know about movie going and movie making.
Well, not just that, but that like ILM ended up being the studio house that drove effects through the 80s. I mean, all the CG stuff that we think of when we think of Young Sherlock Holmes or Wrath of Khan or The Abyss, like all that stuff was ILM. The thing they did in Star Wars before they got to this digital sort of workflow was motion control camera, right? So if you explain a little bit about what that is, like how does that work?
Basically, you used to have it was camera on a big arm, and you would have to time everything up so that the ship would move the model, because they actually used models back then, and everything would have to be timed just right, and there was like optical printing and blue screen and everything. And as a kid, one of the things that got me interested in filmmaking were the sort of making of Star Wars books that they would put out. And it was just fascinating, every element of it, from the sound to creature makeup to ship building to everything, set building, everything was fascinating.
I think that really goes into that tangibility of the world too, right? When you're using models and you're using things like, well, on the sound design, going out and actually hitting a guy wire on an antenna to make a laser sound instead of just, altering a waveform.
and screwing up the different sounds of animals.
And even the iconic title screen, that was analog. That wasn't digital at that point. They actually put that on a big light screen, and they filmed that going up.
And we were also accepting, though, too, of like matte boxes. Like when you would see it on video, I mean, nowadays it would be like, when Hobbit came out in 48 frames, people freaked out. Imagine back then when you go to the movie, you just see a big box of totally, showing that it's all fake. You're like, oh, I love this. This is fantastic.
Well, you just sounded. I wouldn't want us to get past this point without mentioning John Williams and the symphonic score.
God!
Right, the
Sci-fi movies had been all electronic to that point.
Yeah, the difference that makes, it's not some guy sitting there with electronic instruments. Here you get this boom, 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 full orchestras, and even when they go off to kind of the weird stuff,
he could have just gotten you, Jared.
But it was big and it was brash and it was bold, and there hadn't really been
like you.
Yeah, exactly. Hadn't been anything like it for a long time, and especially in science fiction. Not only that, but you had these themes that kind of fit the set pieces and the moments, right? These motifs,
It also again pulls on the things that everybody's familiar with, right? It's kind of a soundtrack that everybody kind of understands orchestras. Where a lot of the sci-fi soundtracks at the time, you're using theremins, you're using moogs, like it's very
and it harkens back though too to like the old serials, the Flash Gordon stuff again, like the fact that even the way the movie is paced and the type of music that was used, it goes with the idea of every 10 minutes something has to happen, and there's this sort of melodramatic swelling music, and it really is just a huge big screen serial.
Well, these elements didn't come in until a little bit later. I mean, the other big revolution that Star Wars brought to us, to sort of this whole culture that we love, is the world of the movie that exists outside of the movie.
Right.
Yeah,
Toys, comic books, all these extra
I was going to
elements.
say, I think the thing that probably really mattered more to me at that age, because I was really young when Star Wars came out, I was probably 4 or 5, are the toys themselves. I mean, I had the little action figures. I had my suitcase or my briefcase with all the action figures. I still carry it into meetings today. Not really, but man, I wish I still had that.
What's funny, because action figures up to that point were 8 or 12 inches, right? And you would clothe them in different outfits. It was a G.I. Joe, and you'd put a Batman outfit on them, or you'd put something else on them. This was the first time that this scale was really popularized. And what I really love about those old toys is just the total denial of the EU, right? There was a toy called Walrus Man, because somebody was an extra in the back of the cantina scene. And like, they hadn't really thought that far ahead, so they just said, look, let's put out a toy that's just called Snaggletooth, and it's this guy that we saw in the frame of a
Right. I had a bunch of those, right? And I made my own little stories behind those guys, because there was no backstory for those guys. And it was great, go over and play with your friends, and all of a sudden you're creating these scenarios for these action figures, and you're expanding the universe of that.
Another thing that worked with those tiny action figures, because they cut the form factor down, there was room to make big vehicles to put them in.
Yes.
You could still fly around. And
the Millennium Falcon was so cool. The
exactly.
whole top coming
yeah,
on.
Guys, we could do a whole episode about Star Wars. I love it. I could talk about that all day.